There are 50 states to choose from. We sacrificed everything for 4 years. One of the most significant Christian networks, Daystar demonstrated that its members were successful, powerful, and devout. However, Jonathan Lamb has now revealed a billion-dollar secret that nobody anticipated. His announcement is rocking the ministry world to its foundation, sending both detractors and devoted followers in need of clarification. Is this the long-awaited truth, or may this be the beginning of Daystar's demise? From the moment Jonathan Lamb was old enough to enter Daystar's halls, he felt as though his future was predetermined. His father, Marcus Lamb, was more than just a television celebrity and preacher. He transformed a concept into one of the world's most powerful Christian networks. Being raised in such a setting meant more to Jonathan than simply witnessing the manifestation of his father's history. One day he would be trained to carry it himself. Everyone else knew, even though they didn't say anything. One day, Jonathan would be in command when the torch was passed. The path appeared to be entirely obvious once he reached adulthood. He was more than the son of Marcus Lamb. They were training him to be the next boss. He participated in meetings and on shows, so he had inside knowledge of how the network operated. No one at Daystar considered him a backup or potential option. They believed he ought to be the heir. The employees trusted him. The board already had written plans for him, and anybody who saw him knew who he was. There was no dispute, and it was obvious. When Marcus departed, Jonathan was next in line. That plan collapsed under the weight of Marcus's death in 2021. When a leader passed away, the entire globe was saddened. It was more than sadness, though, for Jonathan. At last, he was performing the role he had spent his entire life honing. Overnight, the burden of responsibility landed upon him. A billion-dollar church, a global following, and the continuation of a long-standing family name. He had to bear it all. Many of the onlookers believed it to be fate. Where the father stopped off, the child would continue. Everything appeared to fit together flawlessly from the outside, as if a screenplay were being read. Jonathan would continue what Marcus had built. The gift would be handed on unchanged, like a family heirloom. Nobody was unsure. Jonathan didn't for a while. After all, he was born into this existence. Before he could choose his own, a story was written for him. At that point, we were more prepared than ever. When will Jonathan be ready? Was a question I couldn't stop asking God. Jonathan Lamb had always understood the significance of his family name. From an early age, it appeared like everyone expected him to follow in his father's footsteps. For years, this was his life. He became well-versed in the network. Portrayed the role of the son preparing for his doom, stood on stages and asked questions. When Marcus died, Jonathan had little time to consider if he was prepared. Everyone assumed that he would accept the part with pleasure. From the outside, it appeared to be a seamless transition. Taking on prominent parts appeared to be the next logical step for Marcus Lamb's kid. But the reality was more messier when Jonathan peered inside. He initially convinced himself that the uneasiness he was experiencing was simply melancholy. His father had passed away. The burden of continuing the endeavor came along with that loss. However, as the weeks passed, Jonathan came to understand that there were other things causing him to feel bad besides his grief. It was the burden of anticipation. Marcus's influence permeated every decision he made and every statement he made. No one thought of him as Jonathan. They recognized him as Marcus's son and realized he needed to maintain Daystar's original state. I was dying from the pressure. When he was in public, he walked confidently and grinned. He discussed God's own timing, trust, and leaving a legacy. However, Jonathan battled an increasing sensation of stress when he was by himself. Late at night, he chatted to his wife Susie about topics he couldn't share with anybody else. He acknowledged that he had a persistent inquiry and doubts. Did others choose this path for him, or was this truly his calling? As Jonathan assumed greater authority, the fissures became increasingly apparent. He was aware that politics, financial strains, and an unrelenting drive to preserve the image at all costs were hidden beneath the well-rehearsed speeches and flawless performances. Service was no longer the main focus. It was crucial to surviving and sustaining the machine. Meetings weren't always about vision and prayer. They were mostly about numbers, appearances, and tactics to maintain power. Jonathan seemed to be acting out a screenplay that didn't align with the reality he instinctively recognized. He was surrounded by quiet, which made the battle more difficult. There was an unwritten rule in the company. You don't ask how things operate. You don't express concerns. You won't damage the image. Jonathan was aware that going out may be very expensive. It would be considered treason for him to remain silent, but it would equally be considered betrayal to challenge how things were done. That tug of war within him won out. Susie sensed it too. She wasn't merely observing her husband's difficulties while sitting there. She and he were going through it together. Both of them felt the burden of expectation as they reared their children and questioned the type of example they were setting. How did they instill faith in their children? Or did they educate them to be silent in order to maintain order? The questions become more difficult than Jonathan's title. Little changes in Jonathan started to become apparent. He found it difficult to disagree with decisions made in meetings, even when they made him ill. He recognized phrases like, "This is how things are done," and "it's just strategy," as excuses to give in. Each time he went, he felt more distant from tranquility. The youngster who once aspired to devote his life to serving God now felt like a man trapped in a system determined solely by appearance. It wasn't a bomb in his inner war. There were no significant altercations or moments of rage. Rather, it was steady and silent, like if something were constantly biting him. He asked God whether this was indeed his plan in his nightly prayers. Sometimes all he could hear was quiet. Occasionally he sensed a whisper in his soul, asking him to relax, stand back, and have faith that obedience was more significant than labels. But it was frightening to leave something so secure. It was more than just a job at Daystar. Millions of people were impacted by the billion-dollar ministry that was his family's legacy. Walking away from it was not only risky, it was impossible. It would be viewed as a sign of weakness, failure, or even treachery. However, Jonathan was unable to ignore what was happening inside of him. The more he attempted to stop it, the louder it became. He initially believed that the true test of his religion was not maintaining the authority his father had established. He had to have the courage to let it go. His concern was not for wealth or influence. It was a moral issue. For his own comfort, could he continue to pretend? Or even if it caused more difficulties, would he put the truth above all else? Most people wouldn't notice that Jonathan was going through a difficult period. It's the type that doesn't make headlines. A man who appeared to have it all collapsed behind closed doors. When he looked in the mirror, he felt empty. It was slowly realizing that inheritance isn't the only aspect of fate. Sometimes you have to give up. Furthermore, giving up meant Jonathan had to confront the possibility that quitting rather than leading Daystar was his true calling. Jonathan Lamb's decision to leave Daystar wasn't made hastily. It wasn't thrilling. There was no thunderous speech, no slammed door, no stunned news release. For it to happen gradually and subtly, months of restless nights, hushed prayers, and lengthy conversations with Susie were required. Expectations had weighed heavily on him for a while. It gave him the impression that he was destined for leadership, and that he was the key to a billion-dollar ministry's success. But the harder he attempted to play that role, the worse he felt. The majority of people would have done everything to be Jonathan. He had a global platform, was safe, and was strong. He would be heard by a large audience. The employees would follow his instructions. Preachers and other leaders have been vying for influence like his for years. Jonathan, however, did not consider it to be power. It was like to being imprisoned. Every action he took and every word he uttered was measured. He was unable to lead with integrity or to question or doubt. Instead, he was instructed to maintain the positive reputation his father had established by smiling and keeping the machine running. At first, he attempted to convince himself that he could manage it. It was only a season, he reminded himself, and there was always a cross to bear as a leader. In his heart, he understood that staying would be more expensive than going. If he remained, he would gradually lose his serenity, his integrity, and perhaps even his religion. He had the impression that someone else was developing inside of him. Someone who wanted to say no, but instead nodded during conversations. Someone who, despite their inner sadness, put on a show for the cameras. It was a frightening realization. The criteria and the organization weren't difficult. He inherited it from his father. With a lot of passion and an open mind, Marcus Lamb created Daystar. Sometimes it felt like a betrayal to leave. Jonathan was ashamed of his actions and worried that he would be viewed as having failed his father, the church, and the millions of people who had put their faith in Daystar. He feared disappointing the employees, the audience, and the family who had dedicated their entire lives to the church. However, the more he prayed, the more he realized that remaining, lying, and caving in was also not a way to honor his father's memory. Legacy was not about preserving a photograph. It had to do with being honest. Susie stayed the entire time. She took the burden for him, reminding him that no title mattered more than their harmony. On certain nights, she sobbed because she was afraid of what would occur if they went, what would become of their children. Without the consistent income, how would they manage? If someone gave up something that others considered a blessing, what would people say? Despite her fear, she knew Jonathan was correct. A world of giving and receiving was not suitable for their children's upbringing. They had to be prepared to follow God and be courageous themselves before they could advise their children to do so. Therefore, the decision was made gradually rather than all at once. It blossomed like a seed in their hearts and became something they could not ignore because they prayed and wept over it. Jonathan stayed because he was upset. He stayed because he wanted to be recognized. He left because being there cost him his soul, and there was no mission, no remuneration, no title worth that price. When the time came to ultimately stand down, it was both liberating and painful. As he left the building, Jonathan recalls feeling both lighter and sadder because he had lost someone. He was aware that he had to leave behind familiarity, comfort, and safety. He was aware that some would accuse him of being weak or of having abandoned the objective. But for the first time in years, he felt at ease. Even if it cost you everything, you know that you made the correct decision. That is the type of tranquility that results from safety. When Jonathan and Susie relinquished power, they discovered unexpected things. They discovered that being in command all the time isn't what it means to be a boss. You must be able to let go. They discovered that if you can't sleep at night without going to hell, it doesn't matter how enormous your platform is. They discovered that when things are going well, faith isn't tested. Your faith is tested when God commands you to trust Him and venture into the unknown. The days following my departure were difficult. The safety they had always known vanished, the lights turned out, and they stopped getting paid. They had to take care of their children and pay their expenses, but they were at a loss for what to do next. I was asked questions by some pals. While some supported them, others couldn't comprehend why they would leave so much behind. In whispers, some even implied that Jonathan must have failed or committed a transgression. Jonathan needed to recall why he had left in the first place, despite the painful nature of the reports. The opinions of others didn't matter. He had to answer the call that was in his heart. Slowly, Jonathan and Susie began to stand up again. Success is measured by steady, little steps, rather than by major events and global influence, which is how most people define success. Their time with their children increased. They invested time and energy in connections that transcended identities and occupations. They prayed without concern for the presence of cameras. Even when it wasn't enjoyable, they lived honest lives. They felt a sense of freedom that they hadn't experienced in years during those little, routine days. Looking back, Jonathan realized that the best decision he could have taken was to cede power. The journey wasn't simple. Although it wasn't a safe road, it was the truthful one. He is not surprised to learn that strength is not derived from power. It happens when you're willing to let go. Despite having the authority to govern an empire, he chose to protect his soul. That decision not only altered his life, but also his family's destiny. His children had to learn the hard way that being a follower of God was more significant than fame or fortune. Susie found strength in witnessing her husband prioritize respect over comfort. Jonathan discovered that when everyone else wants you to stay, it might often be the most courageous thing to go in silence. Although it can offer you a sense of security, respect, and control, power cannot bring you joy. Finding the one item Jonathan couldn't live without made everyone believe he had lost everything. He is at peace with both himself and God. In the end, that was more valuable than all the power Daystar could have provided. Jonathan Lamb and his wife Susie understood they were giving up more than just their careers and paychecks when they left Daystar. They were venturing into the unknown without a safety net, a certain future, or cheers on the other side. Jonathan has been an experienced leader for years. It appeared to be a stage, a camera, a well-groomed man, and powerful speech. It appeared to be his self-assured father, Marcus Lamb, who established a sizable business. Jonathan believed for a long time that he would have to follow in their footsteps. However, he came to a very significant realization after leaving. Being a leader can be done in a variety of ways. Having a title did not equate to being a leader. Telling the truth could mean that. At first, this revelation was both liberating and frightening. For the first time, Jonathan was able to be himself, without wearing a mask that didn't match his true self. He had lost all the knowledge he believed he had about his future, which made it frightening. No one provides you a plan when you turn off the electricity. When you reject the item you were brought up to get, there are no detailed directions on how to start afresh. Jonathan and Susie had only hope. They also needed to be less afraid and more hopeful. Their days changed almost immediately. Long meetings, significant financial decisions for a billion-dollar corporation, and the pressure to appear flawless in front of others were all gone. Rather than business strategies, there were long walks, dinners when everyone sat down, peaceful mornings at home, and conversations that concluded with prayer. It wasn't thrilling. It was real, even though no one would describe it as great. Jonathan started to realize that there were small ways to become a leader, in the way he reared his children, loved Susie, and interacted with people when no one was looking. However, they sensed the uncertain future approaching them. They did what they believed to be right, but it did not stop their bills. Their bills still needed to be paid. Food still needed to be purchased. They still needed to provide for their children's safety, education, and clothing. Jonathan also experienced evenings when he was unable to go asleep because he was certain that he had done something awful. Many believed that ceding power was both a good idea and a moral transgression. They lacked a plan B, a safety net, and a sizable savings account. They believed God would make a way. And gradually, in unexpected ways, assistance arrived. Friends supported one another. The prospects were slim. Speaking engagements where their genuineness was more important than their appearance. When couples needed someone to talk to who wasn't involved in church politics, we met with them privately for counseling. They were significant, but he was accustomed to large, ostentatious platforms like these. Jonathan discovered that even in the absence of bright lighting, his voice could still be heard clearly, and perhaps it needed honesty now more than ever. Susie's contribution to this new leadership style was equally significant. She was no longer only a wife supporting her husband. Together, she assisted them in creating a new existence in which they could both lead from a position of weakness rather than virtue. Their children watched more than they listened, she frequently told Jonathan. They would learn what it meant to be a leader from Jonathan's actions rather than his words on stage. When no one else was present, they both relied on that idea. The future was never entirely certain. They were still being questioned and talked about behind their backs by people who didn't comprehend why they had departed. Jonathan was perceived by some as having failed. It was considered a crime by some. Few individuals believed that someone would willingly cede authority in order to maintain harmony. However, Susie and Jonathan had to ignore it. Their appearance no longer determined their life. They have to do with being honest, even when it was expensive to tell the truth. After some time, Jonathan understood that he still had the capacity to lead. It was just different. Because of his position and authority, he used to be in command. This is where he set an example. He had already taught about religion. When he had no idea what would happen, he trusted God and lived it out. The guidance was there, but it was more difficult to see. It has nothing to do with managing a massive company. As a leader, it was about being truthful with his family. No attention mattered more than that. For the first time in years, Jonathan said to a close friend, he felt at ease when he glanced in the mirror. "I'm not trying to be someone else anymore," he remarked quietly. That tranquility turned into a bulwark, a reminder that, if they were honest with themselves, the uncertain future need not be frightening. They did have less cash. Indeed, their chances were reduced, but they did make a mistake. Their liberation came at a cost, but it was worthwhile. In actuality, Jonathan was clueless about what would come next. Was he ever going to resume his official preaching? Did he wish to disappear, write books, or give speeches on stage? He was at a loss for what to do. That was the idea. For the first time, he wasn't living his life in accordance with a narrative that had been written by someone else. He was taking things one step at a time, guided by confidence and serenity rather than beauty or strength. Ultimately, a new kind of authority emerged. Real, yet not ostentatious or noisy. Jonathan and Susie had something they hadn't enjoyed in years, despite their uncertainty about what would happen. I hope. Not the type that is founded on labels or money, but rather on honesty, family, and faith. That type of hope is sometimes the finest foundation.